Hello, and welcome to this pre-recorded feedback event for the June 2015 External Assessment Unit 1, Digital Media Sectors and Audiences. To help you get the most out of this feedback, you may want to have the following documents handy, as we will refer to them during the session. The first item we are going to look at differentiated learners rather well. In this question, learners were required to respond to an image and pick out stylistic codes that had been deliberately used to create meaning for the audience. Here we have an example of a learner who has been able to both identify two codes that had been used, the use of a particular type of font and splatter effect for the main title, as well as the desaturated photograph, and also link these to the effect that these will have upon the audience, how they anchor the poster to a particular genre and theme. In this case, the learner is able to explain the use of each of the stylistic codes, and can therefore access 2 marks for each point. Total 4 marks. There are numerous questions in the paper that use the explain command verb. In general, these questions differentiate between learners who write simple answers that give an example, and those more successful who can link their example to the effect that the example has on either the audience, the success of the product, the producer, etc. Centers should prepare learners to be able to justify and link their responses when faced with this type of question. In this example, the learner clearly has not fully attempted to explain the effect of the stylistic codes that have been used. It has been included here to illustrate the point that learners can be very economical with their answers. Here, through identifying bold text and a dark background, the learner has been able to identify 2 valid stylistic codes used by the poster, and therefore receives 2 marks. The learners who did well had obviously been prepared well by centers, and would have perhaps discussed similar products in class. The best responses were able to identify valid stylistic codes, and not fixate on elements that are solely content, like the web address being included, and then explain how these codes work with the audience. This question was effective in differentiating between stronger and weaker learners. Question 7C is the last part of a 3-part item that introduces learners to a gaming website that is owned by a major games company. Learners were asked to explain why this might influence the audience. A lot of learners were unable to link the ownership of the website and how this may influence the audience to purchase their games. In this example, the learner has identified how the company would be able to feature their games more strongly, and that this would have an impact on the success of the games. In this response, the learner has identified the potential for bias from the company, but they have not linked this point to the impact on the sales for their games or the influence on the audience. This is the key difference between learners who receive 1 and 2 marks for explain questions. Within the mark scheme for these items, the wording asks for examiners to look for a linked response. This means that learners need to link their identified point to the effect this has on a product or the audience, and take a further cognitive step for this answer. This might seem harsh in the case of this particular response, as the learner has clearly understood how the company may use their privileged position of ownership of the website, but crucially, they have not linked this to the effect on the audience, which was what the question asked them to do. Learners who did well on this question were able to firstly identify the issue of ownership, and then link this to the impact on the audience and the games company. In many cases, there were learners who were distracted by the term major in the question. These learners created a response that inferred that as the website was owned by a major games company, then the company would already have a good reputation, and this would lead to a good website. Unfortunately, these learners had missed the point of the question. Take a look at this question and response. Using the mark scheme for question 7b, mark this learner for the question. It can receive no marks, 1 mark or 2 marks. What do you think? You may wish to pause the playback of this presentation while you do this, before the answer is revealed on the next slide. This question asks learners to give 2 ways, so we are not asking them to explain their answer. Here, the learner gives an example of a chat room that could encourage collective enjoyment within the website's audience. This is a valid response, and so receives 1 mark. The second answer is too vague to be worthy of a mark. Mini activities could mean creating cut-down demo versions of a game's levels, but that would most likely be a singular activity and not promote collective enjoyment. This response therefore receives 1 mark only. Learners who did well on this question clearly understood the term collective enjoyment, which appears in the specification for this unit. They were also able to give specific examples of how this may be achieved that were relevant to the particular context that had been offered in the question. In this question, learners were asked to give 2 examples of distribution platforms for a television program. Here, the learner has given television and been given the benefit of doubt that they mean television broadcast or digital television broadcast, as listed in the mark scheme. The second answer is fully valid. We would accept proprietary names of streaming services on their own, for example, Netflix, Now TV, as here, or Amazon Prime, as these are valid distribution options for television producers in the media industry. As with many learners, this answer demonstrates a confusion between distribution platform, the mechanism for delivering the media product to the audience, with promotion and marketing, how the production company would raise awareness of the media product with the audience. Here, the learner has given radio and adverts. Clearly, advertising a program is not a distribution platform. Radio could be, if we give the same benefit of doubt as in the previous example with television, although the questioner is asking for a platform for a television program. So in this case, the answer is not valid. Learners were successful on this question if they understood the different stages of media production, as outlined in the specification, and could apply this to the context to give a valid response. Very many learners confuse distribution with promotion or pre-production with production in questions that focus on this part of the specification. In this question, learners were given a scenario and then asked to give ideas that the e-magazine publishers could use to create interactive features for their product. In this example, the learner has given 2 good examples of typical interactive features that could be incorporated into an e-magazine. Online quizzes and forums for readers to interact. This learner would have received the full 2 marks for this answer. In this response, the learner has given 1 interactive feature, the hyperlinks to related website, but also given advertisements. Advertisements can be interactive, but not necessarily so, and could be simply 2D still images, similar to those in a traditional print product. This learner would have received 1 mark for this response. In many examples on this paper, learners have to be prepared to focus on the main thrust of the question. In this case, learners are being asked to give interactive features. Learners do less well when they begin to focus too much on the context and start discussing ideas for the content of the product. Great care is taken to balance the need for some context within an exam question, to enable learners to apply their learning, and to stop the paper being too dry with the confounds that may be produced through distracting scenarios and the effects on learners' responses. It is advisable that learners read and then reread the questions to discern exactly what is being asked of them. This is an example of a strong answer from the first 8-mark question in the paper, Question 10b. If you look at the mark scheme for the 8-mark questions, there is a list of suggested responses, and then a levels-based grid that gives representations of the typical responses at 3 different levels, 1 to 3, 4 to 6, and 7 to 8 marks respectively. This response received 6 marks, as mostly it demonstrated features from the middle mark band, as well as a few from the top. The answer shows the learner making a range of valid points about the increase in non-terrestrial TV broadcast channels, and weighs up the benefits for both the audience and the TV industry. There is an attempt to cover both viewpoints of the argument, why additional choice is both a good and a bad thing for different interests. In this example, the learner has highlighted fewer points and not looked at the different viewpoints involved in the discussion. The answer is limited in the depth it gives to each of the points. So because of all of these aspects being reflective of the lower mark band, this answer received 3 marks. On this 8-mark question, learners performed well if they made a range of points about the increase in TV channels available to the audience, discussing both the effects on the audience as well as on the industry, perhaps that there are more TV companies producing specialist content, leading to a more open job market. The stronger learners were able to look at both sides of the argument, giving, for example, both disadvantages to the audience, that the smaller producers may not be able to make programs of comparable quality, with the advantages, that there will be greater choice for the consumer. Better answers made points in greater depth than those that were restricted to the lower two mark bands. Take a look at this question and response. Using the mark scheme for question 10b, mark this learner for the question. It can receive between no marks and 8 marks. Pay particular attention to the mark grid for discuss questions. What do you think? You may wish to pause the playback of this presentation while you do this, before the answer is revealed on the next slide. This response receives 3 marks. The response is at the top of the lower mark band for this question. The learner makes 4 points in total, so this can be seen as a range, although none of them are particularly well developed, and the second point is questionable as an effect of wider channel choice. There is an attempt to see both sides of the argument, with the point about the higher number of channels being a disadvantage, as this may lead to a less active lifestyle from young people, although this is not particularly well made. Learners did well on this question if they were able to develop a good range of points that looked at both sides of the argument. The key to preparing learners for the longer answer questions is to have them practice writing responses in which they make a coherent argument for and against something. This response received just 1 out of 2 marks. Here the question is asking the learners to give 2 examples of sound that could be used. It is worth having learners review the specification, as questions are written in response to elements of the content directly in the learning aims. This is particularly true of the lower demand questions. In this question, the learners are to give examples of sound as listed in the specification. This learner has given a valid example, but given the same type of sound twice and changed the context. Only one of these examples, using the same type of sound music, is awarded a mark. In this example, the learner has given 2 distinct examples of sound in music and voiceover. Both of these are valid, and so this answer receives 2 marks. For this question and for many lower demand questions on the paper, the key to preparing learners is to make them familiar with the content of the specification, as often questions require learners to directly reference this. In this case, learners received marks for each type of sound that they were able to mention. Those learners who gave the same example of a sound, but in 2 different contexts, only received 1 mark, whereas those who gave 2 different types received 2 marks. This response received 3 marks. The learner has given us 2 or 3 separate points around the question of representation. Firstly, that the characters should be realistic, that if they use stereotyping, that it is not offensive, and finally that the accents of the characters should reflect the location in which the program is set, related to the first point. This represents a small range of points, and none of them are developed in any great depth. This is a better attempt, and received 6 marks. There are some excellent points made by the learner in the response that demonstrate that they can not only give a range of points, they can relate the issue of representation to the effects upon the viewer and the local community being represented on screen. This answer did not reach the very highest mark band, as it lacked the necessary fluency or diverse range of viewpoints to achieve this. In many ways, the response lists a very good range of points about the subject. Learners who did not do well on this question were unable to link the effects of representation to the community being represented and the perceptions of the viewer. Typically, there would be a list of points in the response, rather than a flowing argument that explained the importance of positive representation. Weaker learners only gave a limited amount of points, and some focused too heavily on the storylines that they imagined that the soap would carry. Take a look at this question and response. Using the mark scheme for question 14C, mark this learner for the question. It can receive between no marks and 8 marks. Pay particular attention to the mark grid for discuss questions. What do you think? You may wish to pause the playback of this presentation while you do this, before the answer is revealed on the next slide. This response received 5 out of 8 marks. The learner has made some good points in their answer, covering the representation of the location that the soap opera is set in, as well as discussing how the stereotypical portrayal of teenagers may affect the way an older audience would perceive this age group. The point that the learner makes in the middle of the answer is not really valid or reflective of the context, as it is unlikely that a soap opera would portray anything other than fictional characters. This response, then, has 2 well-argued and fluent points, rather than a wide range. Further points argued as well as these 2 would have resulted in the learner being awarded more marks. Successful candidates were able to demonstrate an ability to make a range of points and explain them fully. They would have been able to create a fluent response that is fully linked to the scenario that had been given, with realistic responses to the soap opera context. Take a look at this question and response. Using the mark scheme for question 12, mark this learner for the question. It can receive between no marks and 8 marks. What do you think? You may wish to pause the playback of this presentation while you do this, before the answer is revealed on the next slide. This response received all 4 marks for this question. For each example, the learner has identified a valid stylistic code and then explained how this would affect the audience. The learner first identifies the lighting, a valid stylistic code, for 1 mark, and then explains that this gives the poster a sinister effect, making the audience think that it is a scary program, explaining the effect on the audience, so being awarded the 2nd mark. Then the learner identifies the particular use of makeup, another stylistic code identified, for the 3rd mark, and then links this to the effect on the audience, saying that it creates a sinister, creepy feel to the poster, gaining the 4th mark. This is a good example of where examiners attempted to be positive about the language and phrasing used by students when responding to the questions. Marks were awarded when there was evidence of the learner demonstrating understanding, even when, as here, there were instances where the learner could have written it more persuasively. Some learners failed to identify 2 separate stylistic codes, or focused on parts of the content, like the inclusion of the web address on the poster. Weaker learners were not able to relate the codes to the effect on the audience. There were a range of common issues across the examination paper, which I will summarize here. For explain questions, many learners were able to make a point, gaining 1 mark, but were unable, or did not think they needed, to link this idea to properly explain it, missing out on the 2nd mark. There are typically several questions with the explain command verb in this paper, so only being able to access one of each of these 2 mark items can have a significant effect on the overall score for a learner. For lower demand questions, learners are typically asked to give responses directly from the specification. So it would be useful for learners to look particularly at the classification of things that appear in the unit content when preparing for this paper. Some learners appeared unprepared for the extended answer questions. There were many examples of very short responses to the discuss questions that did not look at both sides of the argument. Some learners only gave short, bullet-pointed lists in response to these items, limiting their marks severely. While delivering this unit, it would be advisable to give learners plenty of practice of writing extended answer question responses, as well as responses to explain questions. Use the sample assessment materials to give you some ideas for questions, and have learners attempt questions with the discuss command verb, and mark them using the generic mark grid. Learners should be aware of how the mark grid awards fewer marks for lists, or where the context of the scenario has not been addressed. For discuss questions, learners should also be aware of the requirement for them to consider both sides of the argument, advantages as well as disadvantages, for example. When practicing explain questions, learners need to become used to writing linked responses that give an answer, then go on to explain why it is appropriate. For example, primary research can be tailored to a particular need, 1 mark, so that you only acquire useful information for your media product, 1 mark. It is also important that learners are aware of the specialist terms and theories that appear in the specification. A good way of covering these might be to have the learners prepare a glossary of terms with simple definitions in advance of sitting the paper. Finally, it is worth considering good examples of media products to demonstrate concepts and theories to learners that will fully engage their imagination. Learners are members of the primary audience for media products directly targeted at them. Learning about audience responses and theories can be made more memorable by choosing examples that they would have a strong preference or negative attitude towards. There is a wide range of support available to help with the delivery of BTEC qualifications on the website shown here. This site gives you access to resources as well as how to inquire about results, grading boundaries, and other support needs. There are a range of further training events available, which will also be useful in providing support and guidance with the delivery of this qualification as a whole, and these can be accessed via the link shown here. And finally, to access lots of useful support and resources for BTEC First Creative Digital Media Production, make sure you visit the subject page by clicking on this image. Just email teachingmedia@pearson.com to join the mailing list. We hope you have found this session useful. Please take the time to complete our short online survey regarding this recording, as we very much value your feedback. Thank you for your time.